Annoying son-in-laws that think they know everything can be so, well, annoying. This is a story about how one mom got back at her know-it-all son-in-law. The old house was quiet, almost too quiet. Susan Parsons sat in her favorite armchair, a book resting unread in her lap. Suddenly, a terrible groan echoed from the kitchen. It was a sound like a giant beast in pain. Then came a wheezing gasp, a clunk, and then silence. A deep, unsettling silence. Susan hurried to the kitchen. Old Faithful, her dishwasher of 25 years, was still. It had washed its last dish. A small puddle of murky water sat sadly in the bottom. Susan sighed. Her late husband, Tom, had helped pick it out. Losing it felt like losing another little piece of him. Now, she needed a new one. But the thought brought a shiver of worry. Not about the dishwasher, but about Mark. Mark was her daughter Lisa's husband, and Mark thought he could fix anything. He called himself a DIY guru, a do-it-yourself expert. Susan knew better. Mark's fixes often needed more fixing. The next day, Susan looked at new dishwashers online. So many choices. Stainless steel, quiet cycles, fancy buttons. She even went to Appliance Mart. A young salesman tried to sell her the fanciest one. "And you have people who can install it?" Susan asked. That was the most important part. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Our installers are top-notch." That sounded good. Safe. Reliable. Later, Susan called Lisa. "Old Faithful finally gave up," Susan said. "Oh no, Mom," Lisa said. "Well, before you buy anything, talk to Mark. He's great at that stuff. He'll install it for you for free." Susan's heart sank like a stone in a well. "Oh, honey, that's nice. But the store can do it." "Nonsense, Mom." "Mark would love to," Lisa chirped and hung up before Susan could say no. The dread washed over Susan. This was exactly what she had feared. Soon, the phone rang. It was Mark. "Susan, Lisa says you need a new dish doer." His voice boomed. "No problem. I'll hook it up. Save you some cash. It's easy." Susan tried to be firm. "Mark, that's kind, but I was going to let the store—" "Nonsense," Mark interrupted. "I insist. I've watched tons of YouTube videos. It's a piece of cake. I'll make sure it's done right." Susan remembered the wobbly shelves Mark built for Lisa. She remembered the ceiling fan that looked like it might fly off. Done right? Susan doubted it. But it was hard to say no to Mark without upsetting Lisa. "Well, if you're sure, Mark," she said, her voice small. "Great. It'll be fun." Mark sounded very pleased with himself. Susan felt like her kitchen was doomed. A few days later, a big cardboard box arrived. Inside, the new Frigidaire dishwasher gleamed. Mark arrived an hour after the delivery truck, whistling, carrying a battered red toolbox. He wore his faded Bob the Builder t-shirt. "There she is," he declared, circling the box. He tore it open. The instruction manual, thick with pictures and warnings, lay on top. Mark picked it up, glanced at the cover, and tossed it onto Susan's kitchen table. "Pfft," he said. "Who needs these? It's all pretty standard." A little knot of worry tightened in Susan's stomach. "Are you sure, Mark?" she asked. "Sometimes they have specific instructions." Mark waved his hand. "Relax, Susan. I've got this. Water in, water out, power on. Simple." He started to wrestle Old Faithful out of its space. It was a noisy, clumsy struggle. Sliding the new dishwasher in was even harder. It scraped against the floor. Just settling it in. Mark grunted, not looking at Susan. Then he crawled under the sink. Clank, bang, hiss. Frustrated sighs came from the dark cabinet. "Are you sure that's the right part, Mark?" Susan asked, peering over his shoulder. He was trying to force a shiny brass piece onto a plastic pipe. They didn't look like they matched. "Trust me, Susan," his muffled voice said. "It's just a bit snug." There was a louder grunt and a sound like threads being chewed up. Susan's worry grew into a cold fear. Mark wrapped a lot of white tape around the connection, probably too much. He fiddled with the electrical wires next. "Don't suppose Tom left his wire strippers?" he asked. Susan shook her head. Tom's tools were precious, and Mark was not going near them. "No worries," Mark said. "Teeth work in a pinch for these little wires." Susan hoped he wasn't serious. Her head began to ache. This wasn't home repair. It was a home disaster waiting to happen. After what felt like forever, Mark wiggled out from under the sink. He was red-faced, with a cobweb in his hair, but he grinned proudly. "There we go, all hooked up, tight as a drum." Then Susan saw it. A tiny, shiny drop of water appeared on the new brass fitting under the sink. It grew bigger, trembled, and then, plink, it hit the cabinet floor. Another drop followed, and another. "Mark," Susan said, her voice very calm, "I think there's a small leak." Mark glanced into the cabinet. "Nah," he said. "That's just some leftover water. New pipes always weep a little. They're just settling." He wiped the drops with his thumb, but the trickle of water didn't stop. "Are you sure?" Susan pressed. "It looks like it's coming from that connection you just made." Mark sighed, as if Susan was being silly. "Susan, I've done this lots of times. It's fine. It'll stop." He was eager to show off his work. "Now, let's load this baby up and see her purr." Susan felt a slow anger burn inside her. He wasn't just bad at this. He was lying about it. Mark opened the dishwasher. "Let's find some dirty dishes." Susan gave him a coffee mug, a cereal bowl, and a fork. Mark arranged them inside, popped in a detergent pod. "Foolproof," he said, and slammed the door. He pressed normal wash. Lights blinked. A click, a hum, then clunk, whir, gurgle, gurgle, bang. It sounded like a monster truck rally inside the machine. Mark frowned. New motor. Probably just needs to break in. The machine shook. The banging got louder. Then a new sound. Slosh, slosh. Water began to seep from the bottom of the door. It spread quickly across Susan's clean linoleum floor. "Mark," Susan cried, pointing. "It's leaking from the front now." Mark stared at the growing puddle. His confident smile vanished. Well, that's not supposed to happen. He opened the door, and more water gushed out. He slammed it shut. The terrible noises and the flood continued. After 20 minutes, the dishwasher sputtered and died. Silence, broken only by the drip, drip, drip from under the sink and the gurgle of water pooling on the floor. Mark opened the door. Steamy, smelly air puffed out. The dishes were still dirty, now covered in greasy, lukewarm water. Susan's patience was almost gone. This was a complete disaster. Mark looked at the filthy fork. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "This isn't right." "No, Mark," Susan said, her voice tight. "It's not right at all. She pointed to the puddle. Yeah, okay, Mark said. His confidence started to come back. That door seal must be bad. Or maybe something's blocked. You know, Susan, I bet this machine is a lemon. Defective. We should have bought that German one you liked. Susan's jaw tightened. It wasn't the machine. It was him. Mark, she said, are you sure all the connections are right? Mark puffed out his chest. Susan, I checked everything. The connections are perfect. It's not the installation. It's this machine. It's junk. He kicked the silent, leaking dishwasher. The next 5 days were awful. The shiny new Frigidaire sat useless in Susan's kitchen. Every time she looked at it, she felt angry. Her sink was always full of dirty dishes. Her hands were red and sore from washing everything by hand. Mark called on Tuesday. Hey, Susan. How's that new dishwasher? Did you try cleaning cycle? Still having some problems, Mark, Susan said, trying to keep her voice even. Lots of water on the floor and dirty dishes. Huh. Weird, Mark said. Definitely sounds like a broken machine. You should call the company, Susan. He truly believed he'd done nothing wrong. Susan didn't argue. She just said, I'll look into it. By Thursday, as she scrubbed a sticky casserole dish, Susan made a decision. Enough was enough. She dried her hands and found the phone number for Henderson Plumbing. Jim Henderson, Tom's old fishing buddy, a man who knew how to fix things properly. Jim, it's Susan Parsons, she said when he answered. Susan, how are you, dear? His friendly voice was a comfort. Susan explained the problem. A new dishwasher installation that's gone badly. Jim listened. Sounds like classic stuff, Susan. Bad hookup. 9 times out of 10, it's not the machine. Relief washed over Susan. Someone understood. Would you take a look, Jim? For Tom, Susan? Absolutely. I'll swing by this afternoon. Jim arrived a few hours later. He took one look under the sink, another at the dishwasher, and whistled. Well now, he said, shaking his head. This here is what we call a learning experience for someone. He showed Susan the chewed-up threads on the hose. Forced on crooked, and this drain hose. He pulled it out, kinked up tight. No wonder nothing's draining. He said he could come back Sunday afternoon to fix it all. As he left, he said, Tom always said, pay a professional once, or pay an amateur twice, once for the mess, once for the fix. Susan's resolve hardened. Mark wasn't just going to hear about this. He was going to see it. Sunday arrived. Susan invited Lisa and Mark for dinner. She roasted a chicken. The house smelled wonderful and normal. Too normal. Mark swaggered into the kitchen after dinner, a smirk on his face. He looked at the mountain of dirty dishes by the sink. Still wrestling with that lemon of a dishwasher, Susan? He asked, full of fake sympathy. Told you that brand was no good. Susan dried her hands slowly. She turned to face him, her expression calm. Actually, Mark, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Lisa had come into the kitchen behind him. I had a professional plumber take a look at it, Jim Henderson. Mark's smirk vanished. Henderson, why? It's the machine. He can't fix a broken appliance. Well, Susan continued, he said the installation was the problem. The intake hose was cross-threaded. That's why it leaked. And the drain line was kinked, so it couldn't pump water out. That's why the dishes were dirty and water came out the door. She paused. He said it wasn't the machine at all, Mark. It was, and I quote, a completely amateur installation. Mark's face turned from pale to splotchy red. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Lisa gasped softly. Ding dong. The doorbell chimed. Susan smiled, a little too brightly. Oh, good. That must be Mr. Henderson now. He's here to do the repairs. Mark looked horrified. He was trapped. The expert witness was at the door. Susan opened the door. Jim Henderson stood there with his toolbox. Afternoon, Susan, he said. Ready to get this fixed? Come in, Jim. Mark was still frozen in the kitchen. Lisa looked tense. Jim set his toolbox down and pulled the dishwasher out easily. He knelt and looked under the sink. Yep, he said. Just like we thought. He held up the leaky hose with the mangled brass end. See these threads? Forced uncrooked, never gonna get a proper seal. His voice was calm, but every word hit Mark like a tiny hammer. Mark mumbled, staring at the floor. Jim showed them the kinked drain hose. Needs a nice gentle curve? If it's bent sharp like it was, water can't get out. He glanced at the instruction manual on the table, the one Mark had ignored. As Jim worked, he explained everything in a slow, patient voice, as if talking to a child. Now, this here fitting, son? He'd say to Mark, it's gotta sit just so. Snug, but not too tight. Mark's ears turned bright red. And when you're connecting the power, Jim went on, black to black, white to white. Pretty standard, but you'd be surprised how many folks mix it up. Lisa watched, her face a mix of embarrassment and dawning understanding. Jim leveled the machine using its little adjustable feet. A spirit level is your best friend for this. Keeps it from rattling and helps the door seal tight. After an hour, Jim stood up. All right, Susan, let's run a quick rinse. He loaded some dishes and pressed quick wash. The Frigidaire hummed to life. A quiet, smooth, wonderful hum. No clinking, no banging, no gurgles. When the cycle finished, Jim opened the door. Steam puffed out, smelling clean. He handed Susan a sparkling glass. Good as new? He said with a wink. Then he pulled out a receipt pad and wrote on it. He tore off the slip and handed it to Mark. That'll be $185.50, son. Mark stared at the paper. His face flushed crimson. He looked at Lisa, but she offered no help, her expression cool. Slowly, Mark pulled out his checkbook. His hands trembled as he wrote the check to Henderson Plumbing. He handed it to Jim without a word, without looking up. Much obliged, Jim said. You folks have a good evening. He nodded to Susan and left. When Susan returned to the kitchen, Mark was staring blankly at the counter. Lisa was loading the rest of the dirty dishes into the dishwasher. She closed the door and pressed start. Again, the beautiful, quiet hum filled the kitchen. Lisa turned to Mark. Her voice was low and sharp, like new steel. Well, Mark, she said, her eyes locked on his. I guess some jobs really are best left to the professionals, don't you think? Mark just grunted and walked heavily out of the kitchen. Lisa sighed. She looked at Susan. I'm sorry, Mom. About all this. It's all right, honey, Susan said. And it was. They stood listening to the quiet, steady whir of the Frigidaire. It was the most satisfying sound in the world. It was the sound of a problem solved and maybe Just maybe, a lesson learned.